Welcome to week one. This is our first week together, so it's going to be an exciting time as we look at some of the opportunities we have in beginning this class. I want to cover a couple things as we begin our time together. First of all, as you look through the syllabus, hopefully you've been able to review that syllabus and to see some of the things that we're going to try to accomplish. But don't get too excited or get too concerned about the whole syllabus. We'll take this 1 week at a time. Well, in week one, some of the things that I really am interested in, some of the outcomes that we're trying to discuss here, is to understand the theoretical construct around the private sector. One of the things that I'm committed to as we begin our class together is this whole idea of understanding the private sector in a way that you haven't done so far. Some of the lessons that I've learned over time are very interesting in this respect. As I've studied some of the classical literature in formal organizations, I've noted often that I had to make the translation between the literature and the private sector. Oftentimes, if you read some of the most classic pieces, they have been done in R1 universities under circumstances that have a research team and that are at a large public institution or a multiversity that would provide a different context and a different setting. And so as a higher ed professional in the private sector, I've often had to do the translation work. And that translation work is not to be taken lightly. There are things that happen within the private sector that don't happen in the public R1 universities. And so I think the skilled professional is able to take the literature and translate it into his or her environment and in his or her context. And so today in week one, we're going to explore that whole idea of developing the private sector construct. And in your outcomes or your weekly overview, I've called it creating a cognitive framework for private colleges. That cognitive framework is going to be added to over the times together that we have in the next 8 weeks. I don't expect this whole thing to be done in 1 week. But as we piece together some of the readings and some of what Bowman and Deal have to say, we certainly want to begin to develop that cognitive framework for the private sector. I think as we go along and as you interact with the literature, your classmates and myself, and you're able to then apply that to your individual context, you'll begin to understand what I'm talking about. Most likely, if you are involved in the private sector already, you know what I'm talking about. But as I introduce you into the literature, take the time to do the translation work, because the translation work is the real difficult work. Anybody can read an article, anybody can understand that article, but to make that translation into your context is the real work of the higher ed professional. So my challenge to you as we begin to look at the readings today and the readings in the future is to try to look at through the lens of the private college. So as you understand what the author is saying, how does that work in your context is the question I want to ask. And how I want you to apply that to your own context and understand it in a way and share that. What will be interesting about this as we look at some common readings and as we interact with one another, as we interact with the literature, how are we going to begin to share some of the things that we've learned and to see if there's some supracultural elements that transcend each one of the cultures which begin to help us understand the cognitive framework in the private sector. So I'm excited to learn what you have to say. I'm excited for some of the lessons that I've learned, and particularly as we look at the individual contexts that you come from and how we apply the literature to those contexts. So feel free to email me, to call me, to write in some of the blogs and the dialogues that we have on any questions you might have. And it'll be exciting as we unfold each one of these chapters together and understand the cognitive framework for the private higher ed system.